Welcome to the Inside Story. I am Billy Hallowell, and we've got a lot to talk about today. I'm welcoming to the show Michael Gryboski from the Christian Post. How you doing today?
I'm doing all right.
All right, so we want to dive into this story. The inauguration now is sort of distant in the past, it feels, even though it hasn't been all that long. But the news cycle is so crazy, it just keeps moving. But there were some things that happened during the inaugural proceedings that have continued to capture attention, spark debate, and that conversation is, progressing still. And one of those things surrounds this preacher, Mariann Budde, who spoke at the inauguration service in front of President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and plenty of other people in their inner circle. This was a main event as part of the inaugural proceedings. Let's just start there. What did Budde say during this service that sparked so many headlines?
Well, first, some background. To your point, since 1933, the Washington National Cathedral has held a prayer service the day after the inauguration, for the benefit on behalf of the newly sworn-in president. And this began with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The president, vice president, other prominent politicians attend this service. It's an interfaith service, so you have music, liturgy, prayers that come from different religious backgrounds. For this year's service, Bishop Mariann Budde of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, she delivered the sermon. And it was near the end of that message that she actually directly addressed Trump, who was sitting in the front row. And she said, quote, "In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now," end quote. And from there, she discussed issues such as, gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. At another point, she asked Trump to have mercy on those who may have entered the country illegally. What she described as those who in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. And so, like, this directly addressing Trump, this apparent rebuke of some of his plans and his policies, it really stirred up a lot of attention.
Yeah, okay, and understandably so. Obviously, I think a lot of people are aware of that, some might not be, so that recap is really helpful. Before we get into more of the details, let's actually talk about Budde. Who is she? What do we know about her theological, her political perspective? Because that obviously matters to the context of what we're talking about here.
Yes. Well, Buddy is a longtime member and clergyman of the Episcopal Church, which is a predominantly theologically liberal mainline Protestant denomination. She actually has the distinction of being the first female bishop to be put in charge of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. She assumed the role of bishop over the DC based diocese back in 2011. Around the time of her installation as bishop, she told the Washington Post in an interview that one of her goals was to, quote, build up the liberal church, end quote. As she put it, I want to build up the liberal church again so we can be a legitimate conversation partner in the public arena, because right now it's dominated by what many would call the Christian right. And she went on to say that, while she felt it was, quote, legitimate for them to be there, she also felt the Christian right were drowning us out. They're better at organizing churches than we are, she said. And I'm going to change that, she added. So she's definitely, and she has a history of advocacy on behalf of progressive causes, activism, things like LGBT issues. She was a big supporter of the protests that happened in response to the murder of George Floyd. So you see that track record for sure.
Yeah, it is interesting, and this is another podcast conversation. But when you do look at the decreases in faith allegiance across the country, it is the mainline and progressive denominations that seem to be suffering the most from this. It's interesting that her assessment is that that the quote unquote Christian right, which I think in the minds of those who belong to those churches would be biblical Christianity, let's say, that those
Mhm.
churches are better at organizing, that's sort of the assessment. That is very interesting. But again, that's another podcast conversation. Let's
Yes.
kind of get back to her statements, because here she is in this moment. The entire country is watching this inaugural proceeding. She says what she says. There are people on both sides. Let's first talk about the critics. What are the critics saying about her remarks in front of the president?
Many of her critics have argued that she wrongfully politicized the sermon, a sermon that was supposed to be about unity and coming together. And so they argue that she was being very divisive, polarizing, and that her criticisms were not even based on sound Christian teaching. They were just based on liberal talking points. For example, William Wolfe, who's the executive director of the Center for Baptist Leadership and a former staffer in the first Trump administration, he said that in regards to Budde's sermon, he remarked, quote, mass immigration and transgenderism are fundamentally Gnostic heresies, and she was and claimed that she was preaching a false faith that's not Christianity at all. Another critic was Rob Pacienza, senior pastor at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He told the Christian Post in a recent interview that he believed it wasn't really a sermon, but rather, quote, a lecture that really came across as mean and divisive, end quote. And he added that, I think the irony was she attempted to preach on unity, but her rhetoric and her very unwelcoming spirit from the beginning to the end of her message actually created more division in the end.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because obviously you're still seeing a lot of coverage about this and interest at the Christian Post and other places. It was a moment in time during the inauguration, but one that has not gone away because there are deeper issues here. And of course, she also has her supporters. So, what are her supporters saying as a result of sort of this backlash and her comments in general?
Well, supporters of the bishop have argued that her actions were an example of prophetic witness and reflected fundamental aspects of Christian morality, namely, compassion for vulnerable communities, love of the stranger and the voiceless. There's a sense of, comparing it to kind of the Old Testament, when Old Testament prophets would call out the unrighteous actions of some of the more wicked kings of Israel. Shane Claiborne, who's a progressive Christian activist and author, he took to his X account shortly after the sermon to commend Budde, who's a friend of his, for her words. He said, quote, he was so grateful to my dear friend and sister, Bishop Mariann Budde, for bearing witness to the love and mercy and compassion of our God. This is what it looks like to speak the truth in love, end quote. Amanda Tyler of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, she tweeted that she believed Budde was an example to all faith leaders and to all Americans of the value of separation of religion and government, believing that the words of Budde showed the power of an independent church in being able to properly critique the state. So she definitely had her supporters as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that, I think we're going to see that in any of these moments. I think the question of whether or not this was appropriate is important to talk about. And I want to get there in a moment, but I think I know the answer to this. But how did her denomination react to this outrage?
Well, I know that there was a widely shared social media rumor that Bishop Budde had been removed from her church leadership position as a result of her sermon, but that was very much fake news and just an online myth. Reuters reached out to Kevin Ekstrom, who's the chief public affairs officer with the Washington National Cathedral, and Ekstrom explained, quote, I can confirm without hesitation that Bishop Budde very much remains the Episcopal Bishop of Washington. But apart from that, multiple Episcopal bishops have expressed their support on social media for the sermon, which really should not be surprising given the overall ideological leanings of the denomination, as we mentioned before. But let's also not forget that this is not the first time that Budde has publicly criticized Trump. Back in 2020, as you may recall, Trump famously did that photo op with a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church near the White House after a group of protesters were forcibly removed. And when that happened, Budde responded, and publicly denounced the photo op in question. And her criticism of the Trump photo op in 2020 was echoed by then presiding Bishop Michael Curry, then head of the Episcopal Church. So in some respects, this is actually familiar territory for her and her fellow Episcopal Church bishops.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think again, this shouldn't be shocking to anybody who's, paying attention, but I do think this is new for a lot of people in the church who have not maybe been paying attention to some of these, deeper debates and fissures that we've had over some of these issues. Now, let's talk about the time and the setting. When it comes to the time and setting, how common are these sorts of proclamations, the type of statements she was making, historically speaking, during these inaugural prayer services that you do assume would be aimed at uniting? How often do we see this sort of thing happen?
To my knowledge, not often. Usually, they don't. Usually, my experience with these has been that they don't really. Usually, sermons, preachers do not call out the president or confront him in any way during the National Cathedral inaugural prayer service. I know that when I covered it in person in 2013, when President Barack Obama had just been sworn in for his second term, the preacher for that year was United Methodist Megachurch pastor Adam Hamilton, and when he delivered his sermon, it was very positive and overwhelmingly positive. And when he directed his remarks toward Obama, they were positive in nature. So you don't usually get anything particularly controversial with the inaugural prayer service. There are times though when stuff does get brought up that might be considered polarizing. I know that in 2021, when for Biden's term, when he was the day after he was sworn in, Bishop William J. Barber II of the Poor People's Campaign delivered remarks, and he had talked a lot about in his remarks of rejecting simplistic calls for unity and denouncing the activities of the January 6th Capitol rioters. So sometimes stuff gets brought up, but by and large, there's not really this type of confrontational rebuking that you saw with this year's.
Yeah, well, and it is interesting because you have these two sides. One side, and I'm pulling myself back here in total objectivity. One side is saying we have these pressing issues we really care about. This is a moment to try to make a difference. The other side is saying, hey, this was a moment to actually unite people after so much chaos in this country, so much division over this election in the last 6 months in particular, and that moment was squandered. So you do have two totally different sides on even how this should be approached. Why do you believe? Because look, there are a lot of things, and you know this, you cover a lot of stories. The stories pop up, they happen, people move on. Why do you believe this one has sparked such an intense and long-ranging reaction from people?
Well, I think the first big one is that it's about Trump. I mean, need we say more? I mean, Trump is a very polarizing figure. You get a lot of attention if you say anything bad or good about him, and that attention is going to be controversial. He's polarizing to say the least, just by himself. But I also think a lot of people who do not really follow religious life in America, who are not very cognizant of how not all churches are conservative, that there is such a thing as a religious left. I think a lot of them were shocked to see a minister, a pastor, a clergyman criticize Trump to his face. So I think there was a lot of surprise about that as well. It wasn't really expected. I know that there's Jenkins, I believe is his name, who writes a lot of on the religious left. He wrote a book called American Prophets, and that's kind of his big thing. Is he's always talking about, well, there is such a thing as a religious left. People shouldn't be shocked that there's such a thing as a religious left, and yet people do get shocked because Buddy was very correct in her interview years ago that when you usually see religious political activism, it's usually of a right wing nature in our modern political discourse. So I think that was another big shocker as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that all makes sense. I'm going to close it here. And this is a complicated question, so I'll let you go with it where you want to go. But how should Christians balance the rule of law versus compassion? Because that is what we're talking about here. And that's another reason why I think this is such a big story. You're talking about immigration laws that protect a country versus the compassion for the people who have come in. You're talking about that on multiple fronts. Where do Christians and how do Christians find that balance in your view?
I think a good way is to have good discernment based on scripture and logic. The oft quoted Micah 6:8 says that the Lord requires of us that we seek justice and love mercy. And so clearly, both of them have to be in the discussion. I think the problem is so oftentimes people either just focus on the justice part without any mercy, or they give tons of mercy at the expense of necessary justice. And to your point, I think the immigration issue is a great example of this dichotomy, the false dichotomy being put in play, because the big power players either focus only on the justice part, doing raids, arrests, deportation, but not really giving any consideration to people who are actually well-meaning who just happen to enter the country illegally, uh, and or they focus only on the mercy part and just grant benefits, amnesty, no, not separating families, but at the same time allowing criminals, cartels, gangs to run amok. So it is a challenge for sure for people to strike that proper balance, but I think it is still possible to do that. It's just going to require a lot of people in power to be willing to compromise on either having nothing but justice or nothing but mercy. They're going to have to realize that you're going to have to combine the two if you really want to solve this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate your words there. This is complicated stuff, but a great story. Thank you for breaking it down for us, helping us understand. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to the Christian Post for all the news you need to read. And we'll see you here again next week for another episode of The Inside Story.